And tomorrow morning, I'll actually post the recording on Moodle for all of you. I'll share my screen. Okay. And then, okay, oops. This was not supposed to be here. It's supposed to be here. Okay. So today we have 1 hour only. We're going to go over some basic principles and ideas related to humanitarianism. And we'll segue into talking just for a little bit about refugees and displaced populations, because on Tuesday next week, the whole session will be dedicated to addressing some issues related to Syrian refugees in Lebanon specifically, and maybe some data, some evidence, some information related to COVID among refugees in Lebanon as well. But we'll start with very basic ideas related to humanitarianism. And please, if you have any question, if you have any idea or thought that you want to express, you can just raise your hand and go ahead and talk. We'll probably end a few minutes before 3:30. It's not going to be a long session. Okay, so let me ask you, what do you think humanitarianism is? Without looking at the slides, or just what, from the word, from like even linguistically, what do you think the word humanitarianism means?
Human acts that show sympathy, empathy with each other.
Okay. Okay. So human acts that show sympathy towards each other. Okay, that's really good. That's Lara. Anyone else?
Maybe like standing up for human rights and all that, and making sure everyone is equal and like, yeah.
Okay, so standing up for human rights, equality.
No discrimination or racism.
Okay, moving away or fighting discrimination or racism based on what? Discrimination.
Or race.
Based on race, okay. Fuad, did you want to say something? Yes. Did you want to add anything, Fuad?
Oh, no, sorry.
Okay. Okay, so thank you. These are really good ideas from a couple of you. Let's start by saying, what is a humanitarian disaster or crisis? What do we consider to be a humanitarian crisis? Here, this definition is a very, very basic one. A humanitarian crisis is an event that is either internal or external, natural or man-made, that threatens the health, safety, and livelihood of a community. Now, I should have put the word event in quotation marks, because in many cases, humanitarian crises are not only events, they're processes, or they are events, but that these events remain and linger and actually become protracted. Nonetheless, a humanitarian crisis is something that threatens the health, safety, and livelihood of a community. And it can be internal or external, meaning it can be a civil war inside the country. It can be an occupation or a military attack. It can be natural, such as an earthquake or a volcano, a hurricane, or it can be man-made, human-made, as in like conflicts and wars or nuclear disasters, for example, that are an outcome of countries, of people in positions of power making certain decisions. So let's go over some of the humanitarian disasters that we have experienced in the last 30 years or so. And if you can let me know if you know anything about these humanitarian disasters or crises. The genocide in Rwanda, none of you were born at that time, I would assume. The tsunami in Indonesia, the earthquake in Haiti that happened in 2010, the Ebola pandemic, the Beirut port explosion, which happened in 2020. Does anybody know anything, any information about one or more of these events, other than the Beirut port explosion? The first four.
I heard about the Ebola pandemic that happened in Africa, yeah, and like during that time, it's like especially like when it came to flights, like it became really sensitive for all African passengers because they always had to be like they were kind of marginalized into this category of like if you're African then you have Ebola, so there was a lot of problems with that.
Okay. So they were prevented from flying, entering certain countries. Okay. Okay, anyone else? Has anyone heard about the earthquake in Haiti, 2010?
Oh yeah, I did. I
Yes.
remember back in 2010, I was living in Brazil, and when it hit, we had several I think it was firefighters that they went and helped. And I remember like Brazil donated also, and it was like a huge deal back then.
Sure,
So
sure.
I also
Okay.
heard about genocide in Rwanda. Like I researched about it once.
Okay, okay, good. Okay, so yes, somebody?
Yeah, so I heard about the genocide in Rwanda. I actually read about it,
Okay.
like some horrible images, and more so during the Ebola virus, whatever it was. I think I had a good view of it because at the time we were studying like history, and we would go through all the gruesome pictures of people just dying flat out. Like I think one of the worst things I ever seen. It was horrible.
Right, right. Okay, okay, thank you, Ramesh. Okay, as you see, humanitarian disasters can be something like genocide, war, conflict. It can be a natural event like an earthquake or a tsunami. It can be an epidemic as well, such as the Ebola pandemic. I mean, currently we're living through the COVID pandemic, and we would consider that in some cases as it's a crisis that the world is going through, and in some cases you would actually classify it as a humanitarian crisis as well. So we will not talk about the Beirut port explosion today, but I also wanted to let you know that there are ongoing humanitarian crises that are not mere events, but they are ongoing situations, such as, you know, the wars that are happening, that are continuing to happen in Syria, in Yemen, in our region, but also in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Africa, and Myanmar, which is on the news right now, where people, in fact, are severely affected by these wars. And we will talk about some of the issues related to how people become affected in conflict situations, and if they need, when they need to actually move from their home and become displaced in another area. Another issue that has been on the news over the last couple of years is not in our part of the world, but it's on the US Central America border, which is basically immigrants, or some people classify them as refugees, who are coming from Central American countries and trying to make it into the United States. And the separation of children from their families and from their parents is also considered a humanitarian crisis as well. So then in this case, what is humanitarianism? And a couple of you gave really good ideas and very similar to what I'm going to mention right now. So humanitarianism is the belief in the value of human life, all human life, indiscriminately. One of you mentioned, you know, something related to discrimination. And in addition to believing in the value of human life, then being willing to provide assistance to those who are suffering because of a humanitarian disaster or crisis. And to provide this relief and assistance irrespective of their race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, background, or political views. Any background characteristics we've talked, when we talk about intersectionality, for example, we talk about gender, sexual orientation, other types of identity factors. So providing this assistance irrespective of who the person is. Those of you who are interested in applying to medical school, I don't know, you come from diverse backgrounds. I mean, these are some of also the principles in medicine as well, is to be able to, not to be able, but to provide health care to individuals irrespective of their racial, ethnic, national, religious, or other characteristics. And then to do so for moral reasons, not for any reasons related to receiving compensation or receiving basically anything in return. Of course, this is very debatable because a lot of people who work in the humanitarian field receive compensation for the work that they do. Okay, so this is in a nutshell a very simple definition of what humanitarianism. It's really believing in human life, dignity, and the value of everybody's living, providing assistance to everyone who is suffering irrespective of who that person is. Are there any questions about this? Okay. Then there are core principles of humanitarianism. And these principles came into being long time ago, actually. These are not new. However, they've been developed over time and sharpened. The ideas and the debate around some of these principles is ongoing, and these principles are, continue to transform and slightly change. But some of you are familiar with the Lebanese Red Cross and the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is the, the mother organization of, Lebanese, French, American, all kinds of Red Cross committees. And this was established actually in 1863 after someone who was involved as a medical professional and saw, in fact, a lot of suffering and a lot of basically deaths and a lot of suffering by soldiers who have put down their weapons and who were no longer fighting. And then the International Committee of the Red Cross, from that medical, through that activism of that medical person, was established in 1863. And they began to talk about humanitarian principles in conflict or in war settings. And some of the principles by the ICRC relate to how fighting armies should treat soldiers that they capture, for example. And some, basically related to prohibiting torture, prohibiting the killing of even a soldier who has put down their weapon, and also related to providing medical care for a soldier who is wounded, irrespective of which side of the battlefield the soldier is on. So the International Committee of the Red Cross is credited with really starting this whole debate related to humanitarian principles, particularly in war and conflict settings. Then another important development from the mid-20th century, which is very much an outcome of World War II, where a lot of atrocities took place with respect to basically the genocide of certain groups of people based on their religion or based on their ethnic origin or sexual orientation, and also how soldiers during World War II, soldiers who were captured, how they were treated by different sides in the conflict. So the Geneva Conventions started in, basically the documentation started in 1949, but then there were developments, of course, this is why it's called the Geneva Conventions, because it's like 10 years later, 20 years later, there was a revision of the Geneva Convention, a new clauses were added to it. For example, the Geneva Conventions basically lay out what's called the international humanitarian law. And to be honest with you, I've read the international humanitarian law. I'm not very familiar with it. I don't have a strong legal background, but it's very much related to, very similar to the ideas related to humanitarianism on the value of human life, the prohibition of torture, of killing, and the respect for human dignity and human life. This is pretty much, what the international humanitarian law revolves around. And the Geneva Convention, in addition to the international humanitarian law, also had many clauses that sought to govern or control what warring armies could do in the context of war and conflict. Very much related to what the International Committee of the Red Cross started with respect to prohibiting, the torture or killing of soldiers who have basically surrendered, and to the issues related to providing medical care to people who are caught in the midst of a conflict. Okay. So these are the International Committee of the Red Cross documents and the Geneva Conventions, particularly the International Humanitarian Law, are the basis on which humanitarian principles were built. However, there are two other things that are really important that came out also of the experience of World War II. And maybe I should pause a little bit here and just mention that how much do people know about World War II? If I may ask, if any of you come from like a history, political science background. What do you know about Nazis or Germany, Hitler in Germany?
The Holocaust.
We know about it, but as a general culture level, not more than that.
Okay, generally, okay. Someone else was saying something.
Yeah, I was saying the Holocaust happened during that time, basically, Hitler and burning of the books and killing of the Jews. That's, kind of the textbook stuff about World War II that I know. Yeah.
Okay. So yes, what distinguishes World War II is the rise basically of Nazi Germany in the late 1930s and early 1940s. And the fact that the war was basically coupled with genocide. Yes, and Sarah Amran, in addition to Muna, Sarah Amran also wrote about the concentration camps at Auschwitz. Yes, so groups of people based on their religious background, their ethnic background, and on sexual orientation as well, so gays as well, the Roma and Jews were put in concentration camps and murdered basically, and revenge basically during the war, towards the end, or throughout, but also mostly towards the end of the war. Some groups were just killed as revenge. So out of that experience, which is a very European experience, the involvement of many European countries in World War II, and then also the United States got involved towards the end. Out of that experience came the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and one Lebanese person was very much involved in the drafting of the declaration. Charles Malik, his name is Charles Malik, if any of you have heard of that.
Who is he, doctor?
He's a Lebanese diplomat who was actually part of the committee that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So Lebanon is very proud of this. They, it is mentioned in many occasions that Charles Malik is one of the people involved in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So again, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights prohibits genocide, prohibits certain acts that have been committed during World War II. In addition to that, because World War II also led to the displacement of huge numbers of people, similar to the numbers of refugees that we have right now, in the aftermath of World War II, there were more than 50 million refugees or displaced people in Europe as an outcome of World War II. So there were people who were displaced from Germany. There were people who were displaced into Germany, for example, and people displaced from the USSR at that time. I am not able to, so Charles Malik graduated from AUB as well. Okay. Ramesh wrote, is it safe to say that there is bias in the application of the conventions? I know of conflicts that should have been deemed humanitarian events, for example, the ongoing war in Cameroon, in which the government is killing its citizens. Absolutely, this is a very good question. So what we're talking about here are these conventions and these declarations that are really, really amazing when you read them. However, there has been many occasions where these declarations and conventions have been applied inconsistently. They've been applied in some cases, but not others. And particularly, there are wars in Africa, for example, that have been totally ignored or not addressed by the United Nations or by powerful nations in Europe or North America, for example, for a long time. The Rwandan genocide is one example where there's evidence that there has been for a long time evidence of the genocide, but the world community did not respond quickly. Okay. I mentioned the Convention on the Status of Refugees of 1951 because actually I'll mention a couple of things about refugees today. And next Tuesday, I mean, we have to understand a little bit of the international framework on refugees in order to be able to position or to understand the experience of Syrian refugees in Lebanon or Syrian refugees in general. Okay, so what are the that was a very long introduction before we go into talking about the 4 humanitarian principles, the main humanitarian principles. So they are humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Okay, and we'll go over some of them. But before that, let's talk a little bit about refugees. Since we've mentioned the 1951 convention, and we'll come back to, I really didn't know how to position, like to talk about the humanitarian principles first and then refugees, or to introduce a couple of things, just one or 2 points about refugees before going, coming back and talking about the humanitarian principles. But who is a refugee? And this is a definition from the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. A refugee is a person who is forced, and please, this word is one of the most important words in the definition. It's a person who is forced to flee his or her country of nationality due to persecution. Okay, now the copy-pasted or the exact definition of a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to return or is unwilling to return out of fear. Okay? Because there is fear of persecution, because there is a chance that if this person returns, he or she will be faced with persecution. So this is a refugee is someone who is forced to flee his country of origin to go to cross an international border and enter another country because this person has fear of being persecuted due to their race, religion, nationality, or any other characteristics. The word forced here distinguishes a difference between refugee and an economic migrant. An economic migrant is someone who migrates or leaves his country, his or her country of origin, to another country in pursuit of better opportunities. A refugee is someone who is not planning to leave his or her country of origin, but is forced to do so if a war erupts, for example, if a humanitarian disaster or crisis happens. I want to just say one thing, that I'm saying this, that a refugee is different from an economic migrant, is not an economic migrant, although you will hear me also, maybe in other occasions, say that there is a very fine line between who is a refugee and who is an economic migrant. And that sometimes people are first economic migrants and then they become refugees. And sometimes economic migrants move into another country, not only because they're pursuing or not willingly in pursuit of economic opportunity, but because they are unable to sustain their life in their country of origin. So there's a fine line really between who is a refugee and who is an economic migrant. Yes, so the word refugee, the term refugee, or the definition of refugee, is someone who leaves his or her country of origin and enters another country. And this becomes important because I will tell you now the difference between a refugee and an internally displaced person. Okay? Any questions about this? Okay.
Professor?
Yes.
Yeah, so like you said, that there's this, like there's a line between being a refugee and an economic migrant. I just wanted to ask, so are there situations where, like, because even if a person is a refugee, like they feel forced out of their country, but but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not legally allowed to be in their country anymore, right? Like, it's not like the government pushes them out. It's kind of, they feel like they need to leave to survive.
Sure. So they need to leave to survive away from persecution, or to survive like economically, financially. And there is a fine line between the two. Yes.
Yeah, like you said, persecution. Yeah, but like it's not. But it's still in terms. It's not like they're not legally allowed to be in their country anymore.
Sure. So in many cases, such as in the case of Syrian refugees, for example, there's this idea that refugees can return to Syria, that their country is still there. They can return to it. They may not be able to return to the same area or town they came from, but they can return to other places. However, I mean, legally, they can return if they want to. However, many feel worried that if they return, they will be persecuted.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you.
Doctor, what happens if a refugee doesn't want to come back?
Doesn't want to return to their country of origin?
Doesn't want to return, yeah.
Because of fear of persecution?
Well, there was initially, but now not anymore.
Okay, well, this happens, yes. Well, let me go over this representation, and we can answer maybe your question of what happens if a refugee doesn't want to return. So I just want to clarify that when someone leaves their country of origin and crosses a border into another country, they're not automatically considered this person is not automatically considered a refugee. The person is considered an asylum seeker. So this person is leaving war and persecution behind, and going into another country and seeking asylum or seeking protection in this other country. Okay. Then there's a process, let me see if I can, yes, there's a process called refugee status determination that happens. In many cases, in our part of the world, this process happens through the United Nations, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which has an office in Lebanon, for example. And this UN agency decides whether this asylum seeker is actually a refugee or not, based on the story of how they left, based on documents, based on a number of things. So again, the person is not automatically considered a refugee. They're considered asylum. They are considered an asylum seeker. That person is considered an asylum seeker. Then they go through a process. And in our part of the world, in most cases, this process is done by the UN. In the US, in some countries in Europe, it's done by the state itself. So Germany goes through the refugee, the German state does the refugee status determination. In Lebanon, on the other hand, it's the UNHCR that does, engages in this process. And the person can be determined to be a refugee, or UNHCR can refuse their claim and say, look, you're not a refugee. I don't buy your story, for example. Now, if the person is considered a refugee by UNHCR, then UNHCR is supposed to find a solution for this person. Either this person returns when it is safe for them. So in the example that I think Carl just asked about, the person can return if it's safe. And this return has to be voluntary. The UN insists that this return has to be voluntary. If it's not safe and the person or the group of people cannot return voluntarily back to their country of origin, then there are two solutions, which are very difficult. The first solution is to integrate the refugees in the first country, in that first country where they arrived, or to look for resettling them into a third country. So for example, a Syrian refugee in Lebanon, if they cannot return and Lebanon does not integrate the refugees, then the UN will try to resettle some refugees in Germany, France, Canada, Australia. Okay. If this process doesn't work out and the refugees are neither integrated, they are not nor resettled into a third country, and they cannot return home, then there's a problem. There's a problem that is very prevalent now, where a large number of refugees become protracted, become trapped, meaning they cannot return to their country, they cannot integrate, and there's nobody who is taking them in Europe or Australia or Canada, for example. That's a difficult situation, and it's called a protracted refugee situation. It's difficult for both the refugees themselves, and it's difficult for the host country, the country that is hosting the refugees. And you can think about Lebanon as a prime example of this situation. Very quickly, related to the point raised by Ramesh, there's another group of people who actually have left their home because of the same reason that reasons that made refugees leave their home. Fear of persecution, fear of being killed or tortured. They leave their home, however, they are not able to cross an international border. They remain in their country of origin, but they are under the threat, under a similar threat, like refugees who are in another country. Okay, let me explain this a little bit better. So we have a group called internally displaced people or persons. And the internally displaced are people who are also forced to leave their home, basically their house, their village, their region where they lived. As a result of armed conflict or violations of human rights, or even a disaster, for example, natural or human-made disaster, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. They're called internally displaced persons. If you think about the situation in Syria, there are more internally displaced people inside Syria than there are refugees who have left Syria into Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. There are more than 6 million people in Syria who are internally displaced. There are also numbers of people who are internally displaced in Iraq, for example. There are people who are internally displaced in Sudan. Okay. The problem with this situation is that they experience the same vulnerabilities or situations that refugees experience. However, they do not come under the protection of the United Nations. And they cannot be provided with assistance except through their government. And in many cases, their displacement and their persecution is in fact perpetrated by their own government, as in the example of Cameroon, right, Ramesh? That you provided. What would be a scenario where a refugee cannot be integrated into the country? In the majority of cases, refugees are not integrated. Syrians are not integrated in Lebanon. In many countries in Latin America and Africa, refugees are not integrated into their first country of asylum. For example, Somalis in Kenya are not integrated in Kenya. They continue to live in refugee camps for long periods of time. There are a couple of cases of successful integration where a country would give the refugees citizenship, and the refugees would actually benefit the country economically after they receive citizenship, and they're able to work and send their children to education and to schools. Okay. The particular reason why in the majority of cases countries do not integrate refugees, because there's the perception that refugees are an economic burden. And in some cases also the refugees, there are multiple reasons. In some cases also the refugees are always portrayed as foreigners and outsiders who have different cultures, who may pose a security threat to the country, who may take jobs away from the citizens. And therefore there's always this immediate reaction not to integrate refugees, and it is used by some politicians as well. In cases of populism, for example, when the economic conditions in a country are not good, then politicians can blame the refugees for why the economic conditions are not good. Are refugees legally able to work? In what context?
No, my question was like when refugees, because you said that sometimes they take jobs out of the residents of the country. So I was just asking myself if is it legal for them to work, or they just do it under the radar?
So this is by a case-by-case situation. For example, in some countries, refugees are allowed to work. They're allowed to open businesses. In other countries, the state says, no, I'm not going to allow refugees to work. Or in the case of Lebanon, refugees can work in certain sectors, in agriculture, in construction, and in cleaning services. Or at least there was a time where the Ministry of Labor gave them work permits in these sectors, but not other sectors. Yeah. Okay. Okay, we will go back to this actually, and you might have other, questions about this next Tuesday when Dr. De Jong will present some information about Syrian refugees and COVID. And it's really important to basically make links between COVID and the situation of COVID and access to health services to basically contextualize that, or to think about it within the broader context of where Syrian refugees fit in Lebanon. So on to just a few things now. That was a long, basically detour, or in order to come back and talk about the 4 humanitarian principles. And I'm going to go over them really quickly because I want you to think, about one specific situation related to, the controversy in some of these principles. The first principle is humanity. And this is, I think at the beginning, Lara, Farah, a couple of you made comments about what humanitarianism is. And there's a basic principle related to humanity, which is about protecting life. We all, even this is even like something that we don't even learn. There's like this idea that this is a natural thing, that human beings are invested in protecting life and alleviating suffering. In addition to that, it's not only about protecting life, but it's also about protecting the dignity of those who are living. It's not about only keeping them alive, but also having them live in dignity as well, and alleviating suffering. And humanity is the principle that, basically the argument is that humanity is not divisible. Humanity is indivisible. You cannot think that some groups of people deserve humanity and others don't. So irrespective of a person's ethnic, racial origin, religion, all the other characteristics that we think about, disability, sexuality, if we think intersectional, all of these, these characteristics or identities of a person needs to be preserved and respected through basically this principle of humanity. Okay, so these are the two, humanity is the first moral ideal in the humanitarian principles. The other moral ideal is impartiality, meaning that any humanitarian effort should be provided in a non-discriminatory manner and according to proportion. There's the principle of proportionality, or the meaning of proportionality and impartiality, meaning if I want to deliver services to people who have become displaced because of an earthquake, I need to provide these services in a non-discriminatory manner and in a proportional manner, meaning delivering this assistance or these services according to need and urgency, not according to who I think is more deserving. Okay? So if I need to provide water, for example, in order to sustain people who have experienced an earthquake, I need to provide this water and these services in an impartial way, in a non-discriminatory way to everyone who needs it, irrespective of who they are. Okay. Yes, equity and provision. So these are the moral ideals in the humanitarian principles. And then there is the more practical tools, or the two principles that we think of as more practical tools. And these are neutrality, which is very simple to impartiality, but it's a more practical way of thinking about impartiality, which is observing, it's basically observing impartiality when a person is faced with a politically polarized situation. So one of the principles of humanitarianism is to remain neutral, irrespective of how polarized a situation is, and not to side or to take sides with one group over another. Okay. If you've volunteered with the Lebanese Red Cross, or if you've done any work in a humanitarian setting, you know that neutrality is very much emphasized, meaning that when there's a situation that requires your assistance, you have to go in and you have to provide this assistance, irrespective of who is on the other side in need of this assistance or service. This happens a lot in context of conflict, particularly in civil wars, where humanitarian actors have to abide by this principle of neutrality and not take sides, either side. Okay, I'm saying this, but this is actually the perspective of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And the International Committee of the Red Cross, such as the Lebanese Red Cross, very much abide by this principle and hold it very, like they are invested in it and hold it very dearly, that all the people who volunteer with the Lebanese Red Cross have to maintain their neutrality irrespective of the situation that they are faced with. So for example, in one case, the Lebanese Red Cross was required or requested to go to a certain area and basically oversee the evacuation of ISIS fighters, for example, from Lebanon, you know, on buses and leaving. The Lebanese Red Cross may have political or individuals who are volunteers with the Lebanese Red Cross may have very strong political views or emotions, not only political views, but emotions towards the people that they were asked to basically oversee and protect as they leave Lebanon. Nonetheless, they had to maintain neutrality in that situation. And they had to put their emotions and their political views aside. Okay. The final practical principle is independence. And basically, and this is very important in humanitarian settings. I'm not sure to what extent it is observed by some, not all, of course. However, independence means that humanitarian actors need to make decisions autonomously and based on their own, based on neutrality and impartiality and humanity, and not based on any political pressures by political parties or by the funders that are giving them the money, okay? So this again is a very touchy and controversial principle in which, you know, some humanitarian actors or organizations have been, in some cases, accused of not being independent, of basically making decisions based on you know, political concern, pressures, or basically, you know, these decisions were very much influenced by the political positions of the funders that are supporting these humanitarian actors. Okay, so we have a few minutes and I have a poll for you. Let me take this, close this chat, move this so you can see. Okay. So some of you said that you've done research on Rwanda, or you know about it. But in 1994, in Rwanda, a country in Africa, over 100 days of the genocide, as many as 800,000 Tutsi men, women, and children were massacred, were killed at the direction of the Hutu-led government. So Rwanda is a multi-ethnic country, and in fact, if you are not from Rwanda, if you're from Lebanon, and you basically, you know, meet with people from Rwanda, you would not be able to tell who is a Tutsi and who is a Hutu. Okay. However, in Rwanda, Tutsi and Hutu are considered to be two different ethnic or racial groups. And there was a war between these two groups. And then the Hutu-led government engaged in a massacre of Tutsi, of the Tutsi population. In addition to that, they actually also, the Hutu government, in fact, massacred Hutu people who were opposed to the genocide. Okay. Now, let me see. I need to stop sharing my screen because I have a poll. But before I ask you, and there's no right or wrong answer for this, of course, but I just would like to see your views. So let's say you are a humanitarian actor sent to Rwanda. What position would you take? The first position is that you would remain silent, neutral, okay, in order to help as many people as possible. You are sent there to help people, you know, let's say as a medical professional, humanitarian actor, to heal wounds and, you know, basically take care of people who have, you know, who were injured or wounded but didn't die. So what position would you take? You would remain silent in order, you know, to help as many lives as possible, because if you think that if you spoke out, you're going to be kicked out of Rwanda by the Hutu-led government, or you would take another position. You would say, no, I cannot remain silent, because if I remain silent in this situation, then it means that I'm siding with the perpetrator. I have to speak up. So let me ask you. Stop sharing. Okay. What position would you take? Remain silent to help as many people as possible, or speak out in that situation? We have 15 participants, I think. So I need a few more of you to vote. Only 9. Okay, so I'll close the poll. I'll end the poll and I will share results. Do you all see the results?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. Sarah said this requires deep thinking. Yeah. Okay, so a couple of you, a couple more of you selected remaining silent in order to help as many people as possible. And then 4 selected speaking out because silence means siding with the perpetrator. Let me hear from one person. It's 3:27. Okay, let me hear from one person about remaining silent.
So I think actually, because in the situation, we made mention of the fact that the government also kills its own people who try to oppose them. So actually speaking up is putting myself in danger, which is not wise, and actually not helping anyone because I'm eventually going to get killed. Nobody's going to get help. So I rather just stay quiet while helping as much as I can, though I think it requires a little bit of both actually, but I'd rather stay safe and help than be there and do nothing.
Okay. Okay, so that's one position. That's okay. Someone else who selected speaking out.
So I picked speaking out, but I don't agree in one person should speak out only. It should it would have a greater effect if it's done by a group and from an outsider or someone that's coming not part of the country. It would maybe raise awareness and kind of make a change. But if I'm one person and my job is, for example, medical care, then I think I would stay silent. Do you see what I mean? If I was in a group, I would speak up.
Okay, there's power in a group, in a sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Good. So this is actually is a huge debate in the humanitarian field. Whether humanitarian actors should remain silent and just do their job, you know, give water to people, take care of them in clinics, give them food, or if they should speak up and basically say there's a problem here. One government is oppressing people, or one group is killing another group. And this is basically a debate that is represented like in its most stark, like the more extreme positions are held by the International Committee of the Red Cross versus this organization called Doctors Without Borders, MSF. And I'm sure you've heard about these. And a lot of our graduates from public health actually strive to get jobs with one of these two organizations. Though, I mean, some of our students who are really interested in humanitarianism. The first position, which is remaining silent because you by not taking sides, you can help more people, more individuals. That is the position that the International Committee of the Red Cross takes. And that is the position of neutrality. On the other hand, the position of speaking out and basically exposing atrocities or exposing and dysfunctional structure, for example, is the position that Doctors Without Borders takes. Okay, and Doctors Without Borders have this position B is somewhat irrelevant. Okay, hello, yeah. And then the Doctors Without Borders basically argue that as humanitarians, we have to bear witness. We have this power, you know, being like outsiders or being, you know, privileged people. And if we go into a situation and we find oppression and atrocities, we need to bear witness. We cannot close our eyes and just think that there's nothing, you know, pretend like nothing is, there's nothing wrong. Okay, so Nadine is saying that position B is somewhat irrelevant. Can you just say one word about this before we close?
Yeah. Like personally, I think, you know, like to me, I think words are like very like, I'd rather do something than just talk about something. I think in like it's better to act on something than just speak. And at the end of the day, you know, like being human is to help as much people as you can. But if you're in position B, even if you were to like say something, it wouldn't help as much as being in position A, where you get to help as much people as you can.
Okay.
So, okay. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and Doctors Without, yes, Ramesh is saying Doctors Without Borders do help people. Yes, this is the debate. Again, there's no, it's really an ideological position that people take. And, you know, you can find good arguments on both sides. You know, the argument that, well, you know, if people are being massacred, I need to save lives. I cannot just stay there and talk. On the other hand, you know, in the long term, Doctors Without Borders say that you can't just, you know, heal wounds and not talk about the oppression at the end of the day. Okay, I would love to stay more with you, but I actually have a class now. So we'll pick up from, not this point actually, we'll pick up from the definitions of refugee and asylum seeker on Tuesday, and Dr. De Jong will present you with some data and really valuable information on COVID. And I also have an example. If there's time, I can also present that as well. Okay?
Great.
So we'll see you on Tuesday. Thank you.
And we look forward to receiving your assignments on Monday, yes? So post it on Moodle, and if anyone has any questions on the assignment, please email me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.